All right, this is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet, Chapter 18, The Diversity of American Colonial Societies, 1530 to 1770. We'll be looking at Section 4, a pretty brief section, Colonial Expansion and Conflict. So in terms of Spanish America, right, or New Spain, and recall that New Spain is Spain's colonial possessions in the Americas. There was an effort by the Spanish monarchy to exercise more control over the colonies, and kind of the power dynamic in the Spanish colonies revolved around the Spanish monarch on the one hand, also local authorities. The local authorities really probably had the most power in reality, but then also was the Catholic Church, which also had an enormous amount of influence. And so these different institutions all sort of sought more and more control, especially with the monarch in form of things like taxation, for example. And so during the 1700s, 16 and 1700s, the economy and the Amerindian or Native American population recovered, right? So this is a reference to demographics. So demographics recovered. We might also put economic recovery. However, the effort by the monarch to retain more control ultimately led to more conflicts. In some cases, you had tax rebellions by local authorities. Urban riots in the urban areas. This might be associated with merchants. So the effort for the Spanish monarch to tax led to more what we might call unrest in the Spanish colonies, which certainly was the case. But also the monarchy tried to gain more control over the Catholic Church by expelling the Jesuits. So Jesuits were Catholic missionaries. We might say about this that the Catholic Church was a threat to the monarch and in some cases local authorities. And so they were in part expelled by Spain. This was also the case in Brazil. Portuguese Brazil also expelled their Catholic Jesuits. But this wasn't the only power dynamics at work in New Spain, because you also had the native population, which had been in decades past conquered, exposed to disease, put into forced labor, and continued to be a source for really Spanish repression in the form of taxation and coerced labor. Tupac Amaru II led an Amerindian revolt against Spanish power. It was very bloody. Ultimately, Tupac Amaru was assassinated. He, in fact, named himself, or he adopted the name Tupac Amaru from an old Incan emperor from 100 years ago, who had also resisted Spanish rule. So this name was very much symbolic of native resistance against Spanish control. Very bloody. However, ultimately, Amaru himself was executed. A lot of the same thing was true in Brazil. In Portuguese Brazil, there were a lot of tax rebellions, a lot of urban riots. And so efforts by colonial authorities, whether it was local authorities or in many cases the monarch, which attempted to rein in control over the colonial world, led to a lot more conflict. In the British colonies, there was a similar but slightly different outcome. There was an effort by British authorities to retain or exercise more control over the colonies. A perfect example is the Navigation Acts. The Navigation Acts was an effort by Great Britain to control colonial trade. Essentially, the British Crown dictated to the colonies and told them who they could and could not trade with. This was something that obviously didn't sit well with the colonists. However, in a slightly different situation than Spain, England went through the Glorious Revolution 1688, and this is where the English King James II was forced to give up his throne. And in fact, a lot of the effort by England to retain control was coming from the English King James II. And so what that led to was a little bit less control over the British colonies. And both of these things, the fact that the colonists themselves in Great Britain were conducting more of their own affairs, coupled with the fact that you have a lot of resentment towards effort by Great Britain to control or restrain the colonists, especially in the form of the Navigation Acts, both of these things end up being contributing factors to the Colonial Rebellion in 1776, otherwise known as the American Revolution.